Hi everyone, today we are looking at Unit 2, Notes number 2, Big Business and Robber Barons. So what we're focusing on today is the change in business and how businesses change from kind of these single business owned by one person into larger corporations. We're also looking at different techniques that businessmen use to grow their companies into huge conglomerates that control entire industries. So, the age of big business. Industrialization opens the door for new firms and profits. New inventions create new markets and consumer needs. Oil, coal, and steel are in high demand. During this period, we began to see the creation of American mega businesses, labor unions, corporate corruption, and federal regulation of business in America. So, some of the key components of the era, it defined the idea of American success through self reliance, hard work ethic, and individual responsibility. So, also the introducing the idea of the American dream, but more so that you can accomplish anything through your own hard work and determination. Set up a foundation from which sprang the modern American corporate infrastructure and forever altered the American socioeconomic hierarchy. So we began to see um, really, really wealthy people. So not just like rich people, but people that are having millions of dollars. And in this time, looking at the late 1800s, early 1900s, that is a lot of money. So first, we're going to look at Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie came to America in 1848 at the age of 12 as a poor Scottish immigrant. So him and his family immigrated to America looking for a better life. And so he began as a messenger for a railroad company. He worked his way to the top. He was able to acquire some stock, and with the money that he made, began a steel company. And so he was able to utilize the Bessemer steel process to make steel faster, cheaper, more efficient. And so by 1899, Carnegie Steel Company was manufacturing more steel than all the factories in Great Britain. His success was due to the fact that he continually searched for ways to make better products more cheaply. He incorporated new machinery and techniques. So he is constantly being innovative. He's constantly looking for ways to make his company better. How can he make this product faster, cheaper? Because if it costs him less, he's able to kind of have more profits. He also attempted to control as much of the steel industry as possible by using vertical and horizontal integration. And I'll explain more about those in the next slide. By the time Carnegie sold his business in 1901, he gained control of his suppliers, limited his competition, and produced by far the largest portion of the nation's steel. So here's the first example that we're seeing of a steel company, but he is producing almost all of the nation's steel. So if you want steel, you have to go to Carnegie Steel Company. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in these notes. But what you're basically creating is a monopoly. So there is no competition. There is no other option for people that want steel. And so for Carnegie, that's good because he can then set prices. But for the people that need to buy steel, that's bad. So vertical and horizontal integration. So these are two methods that different businesses at the time used to control their industry and to eliminate their competition. So with vertical integration, this is a process in which companies buy out their suppliers in order to control the raw materials and transportation system. So you look at verticals, it's going verticals up and down. And so what they mean by suppliers is in order to make steel, you needed iron. So instead of going to buy iron from an iron deposit, Carnegie bought the iron deposit. He didn't want to have to kind of go through a middleman. He's just decided, I'm going to buy the source. Then I own it and I can control what I need. He owned his factories, the machines that made it, and he would also possibly buy railroads to ship his goods or have an interest in railroads. So that way, everything that he needs to do to make his product, sell his product, create his product, is all controlled by him. So that's vertical integration. We'll also look at horizontal integration. This is the process in which companies producing similar products merge, sometimes by choice. So like for instance, something like soda. You have Coke and Pepsi and Dr. Pepper and Sprite. And so I know some of those are owned by the same company. But if they all merged together and just made one giant Coca-Cola dash Pepsi corporation, that's a merger. So then you don't have other companies producing different products. So that's an example of horizontal merging. So we have it right here. Manufacturing, production, processing. So it's merging across the line here. Sometimes, though, the horizontal mergers aren't done willingly. So you have a bigger company that will buy out a smaller company, and that eliminates their competition. And they do that because they don't want to have to compete with somebody else. They don't want to have to worry about what this company is pricing. They want to control the industry. And by doing that, you create monopolies. Social Darwinism. Carnegie explained his success by pointing to his hard work, shrewd investments, and innovative business practices. Many social philosophers at the time explained it with a new theory, social Darwinism. The philosophy of social Darwinism grew out of Charles Darwin's theory of biological evolution. Maybe you guys have heard, survival of the fittest, where you have different species. I think in his book on the origins of species, he wrote about I think they were sparrow birds, and how different birds in the Galapagos Island develop different traits, characteristics based on what they needed to do to survive. And so the birds that were able to adapt are the ones that survive, and the ones that can't die out. So this is the survival of the fittest. Those that are tougher, have the skills, will survive in the jungle. And so what they do is they apply that theory of survival of the fittest to society and to businesses. And so if you think about business in that sense, the businesses that are producing a better product at a good price are going to be the ones that thrive. People will shop there. They'll buy their products. If they are producing an inferior product, one that nobody likes, then they go out of business. And sometimes companies go out of business for other reasons. Better products are produced. You guys might be too young to remember places like Blockbuster Video, Hollywood Video, where you'd go and rent videos in person. Then Netflix came out and you could do it through mail. And now we have streaming. And so as new products are invented, then other businesses are, the survival of the fittest, whatever's going to be the newest technique survives. So the premise of survival and success of the most capable naturally made sense to the millionaires who emerged since the Civil War. So the people that are wealthy, they like this idea. They're like, of course, I'm rich because I'm smart and I'm, the best out there. But according to social Darwinism, riches were a sign of God's favor, and therefore the poor must be lazy or inferior people who deserve their lot in life. And so it allowed for rich businessmen like Carnegie, and we'll talk also about Rockefeller, to justify taking advantage of their workers and not paying their workers as well, because they think that they are kind of divine to do these things. Where people who are poor, maybe it's just because of other difficulties and obstacles they have, not necessarily because of they're lazy. Many of these workers work, countless hours a day in tough conditions. And we'll talk more about labor next week in our next notes. And so this theory doesn't necessarily always work out. So let's stop and think. How was social Darwinism used to explain the inequalities in society? So if you were rich, you're like, great, this makes sense to me. I'm a hard worker, and I can treat the poor people, my workers, however I want. But if you are poor and you are a worker in these factories, you're like, hey, I'm working hard. I'm trying my best. It's just hard when my employer is not paying me a fair wage and not treating me very well. And so it it wasn't meant to be derogatory to poor people, but again, it kind of helped to identify how these businessmen were thinking. Business growth and consolidation. Many industrialists pursued horizontal integration in the form of mergers. A merger usually occurred when one corporation bought out the stock of another. So again, sometimes mergers happen willingly. Sometimes, you might hear like a hostile takeover. So one company secretly buys up all the stock of another company in order to control them. A firm that bought out all of its competitors could achieve a monopoly or complete control over its industry, production, wages, and prices. And so I mentioned before, for the consumer, if you only have one option to buy, like if there's only one option to buy steel, then Carnegie can determine how much he wants to charge for steel because there's no place else to buy it. And that is not fair to the consumers. One way to set up a monopoly was to set up a holding company, a corporation that did nothing but buy out the stock of other companies. Headed by banker J.P. Morgan, United States Steel was one of the most successful holding companies. In 1901, it bought out Carnegie Steel and became the world's largest business. John D. Rockefeller. Corporations such as Standard Oil, established by John D. Rockefeller, took a different approach to mergers. They joined with competing companies in trust agreements. Participants in trust turned their stock over to a group of trustees, people who ran separate companies as one large corporation. So with the trust, it's kind of their way of finding this loophole. So they have all these companies with different names, but they're all run under one umbrella for one company. So they might have separate oil company names, but really it's just one company with a different title. In return, companies were entitled to dividends on profits earned by the trust. And trusts were not seen as legal mergers. So again, a huge, huge loophole. Rockefeller used a trust to gain total control of the oil industry in America. The robber baron. Alarmed at the tactics of industrialists, critics began to call them robber barons, and this was seen as a negative term. They did this because these industrialists like Rockefeller and Carnegie would reap huge profits while only paying their workers extremely low wages, not providing them with safe working conditions, any type of benefits like sick time, holiday leave. They would drive their competitors out of business by selling at a lower price. Because they were a big company, they can afford to sell their product cheaper. That would basically drive their business. Other businesses couldn't compete, so they would go out of business. Then, once they had no competitors, they would raise their prices beyond what would be normally acceptable. And so people saw this as very despicable behavior, morally unethical. Just because you can charge a certain amount of money, should you charge that amount of money? So that was one perspective on them. But industrialists were also philanthropists, meaning that they would donate lots of money to charity. So you have, example of Rockefeller doing these really ruthless business practices, but then he also gave away $500 million. So when you think about New York City Rockefeller Center, it's named after John D. Rockefeller. So he gave away so much money to charities, University of Chicago, donated to build buildings in New York City. Carnegie also donated about 90% of his wealth to charities that support the arts, learning, University, Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Hall. And so they had this kind of dichotomy of, yes, we are really ruthless businessmen, we do really hateful things, but we donate a lot of money to charity. So it was really kind of tough to kind of wrap your mind around, where they stand. And so here in this picture, we have a political cartoon. So you see Rockefeller looking at the government. I think I cropped out the caption, but he's saying like, oh, look at this tiny government, kind of poking fun at that. He's not following laws, not abiding by what the government has established. So let's stop and think. How should these big businessmen be remembered? As captains of industry or robber barons? Are they just they're just using their business practices to make the best, biggest business they can and really not doing anything? At this time, there weren't necessarily rules against it. Or are they robber barons? Are they treating people, gaining their wealth on the backs of other people and through exploitation of their workers and their competition? And so, this is kind of a similar question to Columbus. Is he a hero or was he a cruel colonizer? And so here you have these guys that made millions of dollars. At one point in time, Carnegie was considered the wealthiest man in the world. But on the flip side, they were very charitable. I mean, to give away 90% of your wealth, I don't think there's very many current wealthy individuals that do as much as they did for charity. So federal regulation of big business. The government was concerned that expanding corporations would stifle free competition. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act made it illegal to form a trust that interfered with free trade between states or with other countries. Prosecuting companies under the Sherman Antitrust Act was not easy because the act did not clearly define terms such as trusts. Also, companies were able to find ways to get around the law by reorganizing. Eventually, the government stopped trying to enforce the Sherman Act and the consolidation of businesses continued. So here we see an example of the government recognizing a problem that businesses are forming these monopolies. They are trying to prosecute these companies and they're trying to work for the consumers. Very few cases were able to be brought to the Supreme Court, and because the act was not properly titled, defined, it made it very difficult. It did work on some cases, and it did have businesses at least trying to reorganize and trying to diversify. Later, a new act gets developed, but again, it's recognizing government is recognizing their role in trying to regulate what is happening. So let's stop and think. How did the boom of big business change America? So some of the immediate effects, growth of large corporations, new and plentiful manufactured goods, poor working conditions in factories and sweatshops, increased labor activism. Some of the long-term effects, regional economies are linked, and labor movement wins a shorter work week. So make sure to go back, do your key terms, and we'll talk about the notes in our Zoom.